Okay, so today we're going to talk about putting sources in conversation with each other in your own research writing. So, one of the things that you want to achieve when you're writing a researched argument, like the one we're working on, is that you want to put your sources into dialogue with each other. As you can see from this image here, we've got 5 sources that we're imagining. And these back and forth arrows symbolize the fact that these sources are talking to each other. This is something that Kenneth Burke called the parlor metaphor, where you imagine that scholars who are writing all of these papers and articles and books that you've been gathering for your research, they're just people. And in fact, through their writing, they're talking to each other. They're each making statements and putting forth arguments that do, in fact, respond to one another, sometimes more directly and sometimes less directly. But we can put all of these voices into conversation with each other if we just imagine that they are all guests at a party, and we show up to the party and we sort of see who's talking to who's disagreeing with who, and where do we fit in. Now, ideally, you want your sources not just to talk to each other one-on-one, but you want them to sort of come together as though they are all part of a single conversation. Now, this is tricky if you are pulling in articles from a lot of different disciplines. So if you have more of an interdisciplinary argument going on, say pulling an article from psychology literature, and then you've got another article from biology or physiology, and you're pulling them together into the same conversation. And then you enter the conversation. So you see, pretend you're at the party again. You see who's talking to who's disagreeing with who's mentioning something that somebody else just ignores. And then think to yourself, well, where do I fit in? Where does my argument fit into this conversation? Because ideally, the end goal is that you enter the conversation that you have identified in this group of scholars who are all writing about things that connect to what you really care about and what you're arguing about. So let's try to take a look at how this might actually look in a paper. So this is a little sample from one of the sample papers in the folder in this week's activities. You can see here that there's 2 paragraphs. I'm going to give you a minute to just read these 2 paragraphs silently. Okay, so I'm going to pick up with our explanation. If you need a few more seconds to read, go ahead and pause the video. So we see that there are 2 main sources in conversation in these 2 paragraphs. We have Lee and Sabrowski in the first paragraph and Alonso in the second paragraph. And we can see that these 2 sources are pretty much put just directly in conversation with each other. The fact that the Lee and Zabriskie citation shows up in the Alonso paragraph makes me think as a reader that perhaps Alonso cited Lee and Zabriskie. Lee and Zabriskie is providing us with some definitions of what graffiti is, graffiti kings, graffiti artists, gang graffiti, and then Alonso kind of adds to that and pushes it a little further by describing what might motivate somebody to create graffiti. And so if I was going to give any critique to these two paragraphs, I might push this writer to say that. Why not just acknowledge the connection between Alonso and Lee and Zabriskie and say, literally, Alonso furthers this argument. That's a great way to talk about two sources that are essentially in agreement. So these two sources, they're not really disagreeing with each other, but one source is clearly pushing the argument further. So we just say that. Alonso takes this idea further. Alonso expands on this notion of graffiti kings by describing their motivation. All right, let's look at another one. This is another sample from a different research paper that's in your sample folder. I'm going to give you, again, a couple of minutes to read through this. And when I pick up the description again, if you need another minute to finish, just go ahead and pause the video. Okay. So there is a lot of jargon here, and without the context of the whole paper, it might be a little hard to follow. But the key here is to look at how this writer is introducing each of the scholars mentioned here, putting them in conversation with each other, and then inserting their own argument. So let's take a look at this. So the first scholar mentioned is at the top here, Nye, who provides the first definition of soft power, which is a piece of jargon that makes more sense when you read the whole paper in context. But the important thing to note is that Nye is giving us the main definition, perhaps the first definition in terms of the dates of these publications. Now, if you look down to the left, the second scholar mentioned is Hall, and the writer very smartly identifies Hall as providing a critique of Nye. So we know right off the bat that Hall and Nye do not agree. Hall disagrees with Nye's definition. Now, if we look on the other side of this diagram, we see Hill and Huang, who argue, as the writer says, they argue that China has soft power. There's that term again, but they're arguing that China has it. And if you look across the way, you see that Hall does not agree with them. Hall disagrees. China has no soft power. Now, this is a lot of different voices chiming in on this idea of soft power and what it is and what it means and who has it. So it's really important in a situation like this that we as readers know what the writer is arguing. Thankfully, this writer is very clear with us about their opinion, what their argument is going to be. And they simply say, nigh is unclear, and there's no clear winner here. All of the scholars kind of say different things, and there's no clear definition or clear-cut way to know if a country uses or operates with soft power. Now, this is a big theoretical diagram. Let's go back to the actual sample from the paper and see the moves that this writer is making. So one of the things that we noted was that the writer is very clear that Hall is critiquing Nye. So we have this nice phrase up here at the top, in his critique. This is a great little phrase that you can use to alert your readers that a scholar is disagreeing with or critiquing the argument of another scholar. Now, the writer sets up this sort of every man for himself argument where everyone kind of is saying a different thing by starting the sentence, this ambiguity creates confusion among scholars. So something like this might be really nice if you don't see a clear agreement among scholars about a particular way to define something or the importance of something. Some scholars might say, for example, that it's very important that we focus on grammar in education. And other scholars might say, actually, grammar instruction out of context and on handouts is ineffective and we shouldn't focus on it. So while scholars might be talking about the same thing, in this example, grammar, they might not agree about its importance. So a statement like there's confusion among scholars or there's a disagreement among scholars is a nice way to talk about that. Now, if you see a particular source making a clear stance, then you do want to use action words like argue. So Gill and Huang argue. This is really a good way to sort of say they state or they claim is another good way to say it. But sometimes it can feel a little bit undergrad, if you will, to say states over and over again or quotes. In contrast is a good way to show, again, a disagreement or a change of opinion. And then you'll notice these last few phrases and the last few sentences here really let the writer's argument shine. So you've got turning to Nye offers little clarification. This is the writer stating what the writer has found. And then ending with, it is difficult to determine where emulation begins and economic self-interest ends. This is a nice little sentence that brings the argument back to the writer's claim. And that's one thing that as you kind of get into putting sources in conversation with each other, you don't want to get lost. You don't want to drift too far from your own argument. So ending each paragraph with a statement of your very own that pulls it back towards your main point is a good call. You don't have to always do it. I'm not advocating that every paragraph should end with some kind of prescriptive sentence, but it's smart to make sure that your readers know how all of this information connects back to your argument.